Recording.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Bienvenidos, saludos, greetings. I am so thrilled that you're here because we are hoping that this is the kickoff for our lecture series. And this is only the beginning. This is the first of 4 speakers that we will be organizing for continuing in the spring. I'm sure all of you saw this beautiful flyer. Thank you, Lorena, for your work in creating this flyer. And we're going to go ahead and get started only because we want to make sure we have enough time for breakouts and really cultivating a community of practice around intersectionality and student success at HSI's Hispanic Serving Institutions. So thank you for your leadership and commitment. I always start with a land acknowledgement. And I don't know, Lorena, are you able to read it? I didn't ask you previously, but I would love it if you could.
Sure. So founded in 1889, the University of New Mexico sits on the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia. The original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, since time immemorial, have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. We gratefully recognize our history.
This is so important because it starts that whole process of intersectional inquiry into that history, that historical context. And this is also a labor acknowledgement that honors the sacrifices of Black Americans. We must acknowledge that much of what we know in this country today, including culture, economic growth, and development throughout history and across time, has been made possible by the labor of enslaved Africans and their ascendants who suffered the horrors of the transatlantic trafficking of their people, chattel slavery, and Jim Crow. We are indebted to their labor and sacrifice. We must acknowledge the tremors of that violence throughout the generations and the resulting impact that can still be felt and witnessed today. Again, what is, beyond reading, what is our action and reflection on these acknowledgements? So this is just a bio slide that I'm not going to read, but just to share with you that intersectionality has been part of my academic journey since I started doing graduate work in the 1990s at the City University of New York, including some books that center intersectionality and current projects, including ethnic studies and the revision of the Office of Management and Budget, as well as this project. So this has been a lifelong journey for me. And here's a bio slide on Lorena Blanco Silva, who has been instrumental and has also dedicated her life to creating communities of practice. So Lorena, I don't know if you wanted to add anything else.
No, thank you. It's an honor to work with you, though. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We also want to express our gratitude to the National Science Foundation for their support of this lecture series through a conference grant in the HSI program, and also remind everyone that, of course, as with everything that is funded by the NSF, the opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the National Science Foundation, and our word number is listed there for your reference. So we always start with some values, and we invite you to add any more that will guide our discussion today: inclusive leadership, community, social responsibility, Indigenous data sovereignty, critical reflexivity, multiple epistemologies, and intersectional justice by centering the margins. That is super key, but we also invite you to add any more that you think are also worthy of us to consider. I also wanted to share some requests. Please be present, stay engaged, lean in, participate, make space, take space, and share the mic. Show respect for this space and for each other. Honor confidentiality. We are recording for our purposes of improving our lecture series, but the only thing that will be publicly posted are the actual presentations. So we want to remind you that whatever is said here, please let's try to honor that. Embrace discomfort. We're going to be talking about things that are uncomfortable. And I think that that's the beauty of learning and embracing that spirit of trying to create new understandings. Strive to be accessible in your language. Pay attention to power and positionality. And if possible, keep your camera on at all times. We didn't schedule any breaks, but please do take care of yourself. Go get whatever you need to do, take a breather. I know that a lot of us, we can hear the presentations as we do other things, and self-care is important. So here's an overview. I think all of you have a copy of the schedule for today. So we will be starting shortly with Dr. AJ Alvero, who's going to talk to us about who are we serving, Latinx data disaggregation and college admissions data. We'll have small groups and large group discussion. Again, really the effort is to catalyze system level change by really creating a convergence space for us to share ideas, right? Then we will be having a second presentation by Dr. Yasmini Disari on STEM. And then we'll also do small group and large group discussion. And then we'll end really with an invitation for us to think outside the box. Too often we hear and talk about intersectionality, but less often do we actually put that into action. And I think that we have a lot to learn from each other and share to make that a reality, especially around HSIs and equity. So in the chat, I'm going to invite each of you to share your name, your pronouns, your title, your institutional affiliation, your city or town, and any images or words that come to mind when you hear the word intersectionality. So I'll start, I'll write it in the chat as well. You all know my name is Nancy Lopez. I'm professor of sociology here, my 21st year at the University of New Mexico. And I'm also director and co-founder of the Institute for the Study of Race and Social Justice, and founding coordinator of the New Mexico statewide Race, Gender, Class Data Policy Consortium, which is really an intersectional community of practice. And what word or image comes to mind when I hear the word intersectionality? I think I alluded to it by talking about power. That's the most important thing to me when I hear the word intersectionality. And maybe I'm going to take a few seconds to look in the chat and see if anybody has shared. So I see Juan has said multicultural. I see Yari has says diversity. Any other words or images? It could be an image when you hear the word intersectionality. And I do invite you all to write your name, pronouns, and I forgot to mention my pronouns, she, her, and ella, as well as your institutional affiliation and where you are zooming in from, whatever town, etc. I see identity from Ginny, and she's in San Antonio. Bienvenida. Teresa is saying a canvas of color. I love it. I'm married to an artist, Chicano from Northern New Mexico, so there's a lot of color in our household. And I see who else? UNT Jason, invisible via privilege. Let's see. I see so many beautiful words. I know I'm not going to get to all of it, but I am so grateful that all of you are sharing these beautiful nuggets about what you think of when you hear the word intersectionality. And I will just share this definitions, and there are many definitions, but I like this one because it emphasizes that intersectionality is a tool for change. So this comes from Patricia Hill Collins and Sirma Bilge, their book titled Intersectionality. And it says intersectionality is a way of understanding and analyzing complexity when it comes to social inequality in people's lives, and the organization of power in a given society are better understood as being shaped not by a single axis of inequality, whether it's race, gender, or class, but by many axes that work together and influence each other, that people use this way of understanding complexity to solve problems. So it's praxis. It's not an academic exercise only. It is about critical inquiry for praxis. And I think that is such a powerful definition. So I wanted to remind everyone, the term was coined, I think you all know, in the late 80s by critical race feminist Kimberly Crenshaw, who has done incredible work in terms of making this academic inquiry into praxis, but it has a long genealogy. I'm not going to go over all of the other contributors to this inquiry and praxis, but clearly the ideas behind intersectionality have been cultivating for many, many, many years. This is another image that comes from Black feminist thought. It's the matrix of domination, for any of you who've read Patricia Hill Collins. And she points out that if we want to understand power relations, we have to think about the histories of settler colonialism, white supremacy, structural racism, patriarchy, heterosexism, ableism, etc., nativism, all of these systems. So if we're in South Africa, if we're here in Nuevo Mexico, the Dominican Republic, where my family is from, or in Germany, we can think about that historical context, those structures of power. But then we also can do a deeper dive. We can look at the roles that organizations play. We can look at the roles that the management of power is engaged in. We can look at the lived experiences of individuals, race, gender, class, nativity, etc., sexuality, disability. We could also think about those narratives, the hegemonic domain of power, that the stories we tell. So do our HSIs talk about our students as at risk or as deficits, right? What are those stories that we tell that in a way maintain the status quo or challenge the status quo and create what my colega, Dr. Ruth Zambrana calls equity lifts, right? So think about how the matrix of domination may be operating in your neck of the woods and how it's a structuring structure. So this is another powerful tool. The goal of this series is really to create an opportunity for equity, right? An opportunity for change. So intersectionality is often acknowledged. I think if we look at all of the equity plans, even at the department level or at the college level or at the university level, in many universities, we hear people talk about first generation college students, we talk about disability, we talk about DACA students, we talk about students that are from rural areas, underserved areas, et cetera, indigenous students, Black students, Latino, et cetera. But oftentimes our strategic policy initiatives and our efforts to remove barriers do not explicitly engage intersectionality. There's this mention of all of these axes of difference, but seldom do we see a concerted effort to grapple with what is our configuration of inequality in our particular context. And I think this is an invitation. And at the end, I am going to ask, and you can email at any time saying, yes, my HSI or my institution is particularly interested in creating community of practice. And I'd love to have continued, coffee hours outside of our lecture series to talk about our strategies, our strategic efforts to engage intersectionality. Are you interested in a monthly coffee hour or consultation about creating a community of practice? How can you create a community around this at your institution with the effort of solving problems, of removing barriers, of being intentional in your strategic resource allocation and policies to engage intersectionality? Go ahead right now and send an email and say, I want to create a community of practice. And this is the name of my institution. And this is, I'd be interested. And we can create a monthly coffee hour or bi-weekly where we get together and think about strategies, what's working, what's not, sharing resources outside of the lecture series, which will continue, obviously. And when we wrote this grant for the National Science Foundation, we said, we're inviting at least 25, but hopefully more HSIs to do this, to catalyze an intersectional community of practice by creating, at the end of this year-long effort, a year from now, a one-page data brief. What are the consensus values and current data collection and alternatives that center intersectionality for impact, right? What is my action plan? What's our theory of change? We know that change just doesn't happen. We have to organize. What is your plan for stakeholder engagement? What about how will you anticipate any roadblocks? And what are some practical solutions that you have come up with in your context, a community college versus a teaching college or a university might have a different strategy or an action plan or different stakeholders. And then how will you change that narrative, right? How will you change the stories that we tell? In what ways will your websites be updated? What about social media? What about the equity reports, the academic program reviews that happen in each department, at least in my university, every 7 years or so? How will we change and remove barriers? So now this is perfect timing because I think we're right at the point where we're going to invite our first speaker to share his nuggets. And before we do, I do want to share this quote that really came to mind when I met Dr. Alvero at the Latino Studies Association this July, where he shared his incredible work. And it comes from Bacazin and Zambrana, who basically say, it is urgent that we practice intersectionality in HSIs and in Latino communities. And they say, we caution Latino and Latina as a social construct must be problematized. It's complicated by differences in national origin, citizenship, race, class, and ethnicity, and by the confluence of these factors. An intersectional approach acknowledges these differences and seeks to reveal and understand how they shape experience. When we use the term Latinas, it's not as a unitary term that homogenizes distinctive groups, but it's a term of implicit solidarity with other groups with a Spanish colonial history and genealogical, political, cultural, and ethnic ties to Latin America. To me, that's beautiful because it says we are in solidarity. We recognize that we are not homogenous and we're in solidarity for justice. So with that, let me turn it over to our esteemed colega, Dr. Alvero, who will be presenting. He is a computational social scientist at the University of Florida, Department of Sociology, Criminology, and Law. His interests are race, ethnicity, and education, and uses research techniques to, as you will learn, analyze college admissions essays and model the social configurations of inequality that are visible there in terms of admissions and hierarchies around that. He earned his doctorate, his PhD in educational data science and sociology of education at Stanford Graduate School of Education, and earned a master's of science from the Department of Statistics, a graduate certificate in computational social science. And you all have a copy of his amazing paper with his colegas. Bienvenido, Dr. Alvero. We are grateful for your time, your energy, and your passion.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Let me pull up the slides. And everyone can see that?
Yes, but I think you want to put it on slide view. Yeah.
There we go. Is it looking okay? I'm sorry.
Yes, it looks great now. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Yeah, thanks again for the lovely introduction. I think it's going to feed in quite nicely into some of the examples that I have in my presentation. My presentation is called "Who Are We Serving? Latinx Data Disaggregation and College Admissions Data." So just to give you a roadmap of the talk for today, I'm going to start with just some basic background of why we should consider disaggregating Latinx data, what disaggregation can tell us, and what aggregation of Latinx data is not telling us. Then I'm going to give you two snapshots from papers where I'm analyzing college application materials. So the first is the paper that Nancy shared with everyone beforehand, Income Campus Disparities Among Hispanic Identifying UC Applicants. And I just wanted to flag early, when I use the term Hispanic, it's in reference to the federal census category. Other times I will use the term Latinx. And the other paper I'm going to share some key findings from is called Linguistic and Cultural Strategies, Identification and Analysis of Spanish Language Usage in College Admissions Essays. And then finally, I'm going to conclude with a synthesis of the different findings and suggestions for scholars and educational practitioners. So why disaggregate? Why take Latinx data and break it apart? So I just want to give you a couple of examples of why I personally think it's very important. So this is an article from the National Resource Defense Council. It's a nonprofit focused on environmental issues in the United States. And here, this is just a snippet from an article about Latina farm workers speaking out about different environmental hazards and risks that come from working in the fields. So I also know, so I'm actually from this community. I'm from Salinas, California, where this article was written. I also know that it's not just the environmental danger. They're not just environmental dangers in working in agriculture. There's also it's just backbreaking labor. You know, driving to school every single day, you'd see people bent over, like the people in the picture on the bottom right, just working hard. You know, working raw to the bone. So again, like I have a lot of insider knowledge of this community, and I did a little research, you know, kind of thinking like, well, they talk about Latina farm workers kind of in this general sense. And, you know, the community or the largest city in this area is Salinas, which has a population of approximately 167,000. And it is a majority Latinx community. But who are these Latino farm workers? Who are the farm workers in general? So, you know, what I want to point out here is that actually the vast majority of the Latinx community in Salinas and of the majority of the entire city actually identifies as Mexican. So, you know, I was a Cuban American growing up in Salinas. There weren't a lot of other Cuban Americans, but there were a lot of Mexican people in the community and working in the fields. So I want to give another example. So this was from the nonprofit group Latinos for Education, and they wrote a blog post about after a September 2021 Supreme Court ruling. So again, they also use kind of general language, Latinos for Education. The majority of DACA recipients are Latinx. And again, it has this, you know, it like in one sense, it kind of calls for solidarity. But when you look at the data, and DACA recipients, this data is publicly available, you see that there's a really dense concentration of people from very specific countries with very specific heritages that are DACA recipients. So these are the top 5 DACA recipients by country. And I also decided to look for other countries just to get a comparison. So in Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico is obviously not a country, but even in Puerto Rico, there are 120 people on the island who are DACA recipients as of this data. And interestingly, there are actually 0 Cuban DACA recipients, or 0 people born in Cuba that are currently DACA recipients. And this is you know, this is another example to show, like, yes, like we need the solidarity, but in terms of understanding and research, we actually could learn a lot from breaking things down. And this is the exact point. If there's one thing I want you all to take away from this talk, it's this. These statistics, they're not incidental. They reflect fundamental differences in relationships to U.S. institutions, like schools, or, you know, economy, or citizenship, by regional background, that are fundamentally different. And these differences correlate with educational experiences, different trajectories, life trajectories, and social patterns. And these differences also interact with other dimensions of identity, like social class. So in this way, disaggregating data can actually help surface these patterns and spur better research and practice. So most Latinx higher education students do indeed attend HSIs, but there are very strong correlations between national cultural background, plausible research finding, and best educational practices that are very hard to unearth if we using just the aggregated data. So I'm going to quickly talk through the data that I use in my research and how this kind of perspective shaped my approach to doing social science. So I was lucky enough to work with a large data set of college application materials, including essays, that were shared by the University of California Office of the President. And these include data from every single Latinx identifying applicant over 2 admission cycles. So the 2 admission cycles were 2015, 2016, and 2016, 2017. They include the essays, they include reported household income, reported gender, intended major, spoken languages, school code, specific ethnicity kind of broken down, the campuses that students applied to, and it also included every Latinx transfer applicant, so community college students transferring to the University of California. Importantly, we do not have any evaluation data. So at no point in this talk am I going to be able to tell you, like, and these students had, winning essays or anything like that. All we're focusing on is the inputs of college admissions. And in the papers that I'm going to talk about today, I use this data to talk about the disparities in income and the campuses that students apply to, as well as the variation in linguistic and cultural strategies in their admissions essays. And the first paper I'm going to talk about is focusing on income and campus disparities. So this paper, again, Nancy shared it beforehand. It's under review. There is a preprint available online if you want to read it or share it. So a little bit of background for this particular paper. So, as we know, more universities have attained the designation of Hispanic Serving Institution, HSI, and many more are trying to become HSIs. So as a practical example, as of right now, 6 of the 8 UC campuses are HSIs, and others, Berkeley and UCLA, have publicly expressed goals to become HSIs. And I think the core motivation that the core motivation that gets a lot of people interested in becoming an HSI is that it brings a lot of federal funding. So even if you don't care about Latinx students, you can make an argument that a lot of people are going to be interested, at the very least, in that federal funding. So in this paper, we take a big step back and we just ask basically, if HSI designation depends on students identifying as Hispanic or Latinx in some way, who is claiming this identity and how are they claiming this identity? And how will that inform which universities are designated as HSIs? So again, just again stepping back, the category of Hispanic was created as a non-white, non-Western European, pan-ethnic category to capture a lot of socioeconomic inequality faced by peoples of Latin American descent in the U.S. But how is that reflected in data? We talk about the category, but again, who is creating this category? What are the identities that are creating this category? So the data here, we use all of the data from that I mentioned a couple slides ago, and we combine them. So all in all, it's about 93. It's a little over 93,000 applications, and the specific ways that they claim or identify as Hispanic or Latinx. So this includes the census categories, Mexican, Cuban, Puerto Rican, but it also has this other category. And this is what I'm going to focus a lot of the rest of the talk on, is this other category. So in our data, about 12% of the applicants identify as other. And these students, when they identify as other, they have to type in how they identify. So beyond that, we have the reported household income and the specific UC campuses they applied to. So for the University of California system, you create one application and then you decide which campuses to apply to. So Berkeley, Los Angeles, Santa Cruz, etc. So the first step was organizing the other responses. So as you might imagine, there were many students would write in the names of Latin American countries, Honduras, Colombia, etc. But what was curious is that we got a lot of responses that kind of reference colonial affiliations. So if history lesson, Spanish Formosa was the name of a Spanish colony in the northern tip of Taiwan, what is now Taiwan, that lasted for about 15 years. And in 2015, 2017, a student claimed that that's how they identify as Hispanic or Latinx. A lot of students will also claim genealogical identity. So some Spanish descent. One student even wrote in, my grandparents are from Spain, but I was born in Florida. Like verbatim, that's what they wrote. And I don't share these to like, I'm not trying to make fun of students, but I am trying to, start to question like how flexible the category is. Like, what are we counting? What are the downstream relationships? So what we did is we took all of these responses, and in this paper we binarized them into European versus non-European. And again, this came after the fact that we noticed there were so many students who were claiming some kind of identity that was strongly anchored to European identity. And as it turns out, of all of the students who identified as other, 40% mentioned some kind of European heritage, making them the largest subgroup of all of the other responses. So the second largest was Central American, and about 35% of the applicants mentioned something to do with Central America. So using this, we surface variation, socioeconomic and ethnic variation among UC applicants, and show how this variation maps onto campus choice, so the campuses that they apply to. So this is a box plot. So this represents the differences in the reported household income. So on the right in this red box, it's the reported household income for non-European identifying students. So that thick bar in the middle, that represents the median. Median income for these students was $42,000. And the top of the box is the 75th percentile. So for the European students, the median income was $100,000, and the 75th percentile was close to $200,000. I mean, basically, like this is the students who claim some kind of European identity are also reporting much higher household incomes than the students who are not reporting European identity. So we also look at the campuses they apply to. So here on the y-axis, the campuses are ordered from least selective, so just in terms of acceptance rate, to most selective. So Merced to Los Angeles. Here on the x-axis, we have the proportion of students who applied to a given campus. So for example, if 60% of the European identifying students applied to Merced, that would be reflected in the figure. So I'm gonna present this in chunks. So these are the three least selective campuses. They're all also HSIs. In a recent book about the University of California higher education system, these campuses were also pointed out for disproportionately teaching students of color across the state. And here we see that non-European students are applying to these campuses more than the European students, with the biggest disparity in Riverside. But as you start to consider the more selective campuses, you see that aside from Irvine, the pattern flips. So the students who identify, mention some kind of European identity, they're favoring the most selective campuses in the UC system. So just to synthesize, so this common designation, unless we're very critical and think deeply about who we're counting as Hispanic as we create this designation, they're going to represent wildly different student bodies. And as I mentioned, it maps onto racial hierarchies that have been described in US higher education. And in a way, it's reminiscent of Bonilla Silva's theories about racial hierarchies in Latin America manifesting in the US. Future studies, of course, could consider enrolled students, other regions of the US, and compare other schools by selectivity. So that was a lot. That was the first paper. The second paper is it's going to be kind of a gear switch. So in this paper, we're taking a lot of the same ideas, but instead we're looking specifically at the college admissions essay, so the personal statement that students have to provide as part of their application. So just as a way of background for this paper, so in the US, and particularly in US education, Spanish is a highly stigmatized practice. But I also argue that in some contexts, in some settings, including the University of California, Spanish is seen as a valued form of diversity. So the text on the right is the official diversity statement from the University of California, and they name language as a positive, important example of diversity. So there's this tension in U.S. schools that I wanted to point out. But again, there's also important variation by Latinx background. This is, I think most of the people in this audience are familiar with the Western U.S. I'm also familiar with the Western U.S. This English-only attitudes, xenophobia. Historically, there were English-only segregated schools in the Western U.S. for Mexican students. That's where this picture comes in on the left. But I think what a lot of people don't realize is that the Cuban American experience in Miami was almost diametrically different. So actually, the first bilingual school in the United States was built almost specifically for the incoming wave of Cubans escaping the Cuban Revolution in 1959. So we have, again, the strong variation by background, the relationships that students have between language, schools, and their personal heritage, background, culture, language. So again, with that insight, I do the same thing here of intra-categorical analysis. So analyzing patterns by specific subgroups. So here in this paper with this background, I want to see, how and to what extent is Spanish deployed in admissions essays. So Spanish is often pointed to as a way that a lot of Latinx communities are very similar, something that kind of unites people culturally and linguistically. So I want to see how is it being deployed in admissions essays. But again, with the big twist, how does this vary by social class and ethnicity? And if it does, how does it? I don't know if anyone here is interested in machine learning, data science, artificial intelligence, but in this paper, there was a lot of methodological kind of deep thinking about the affordances and limitations of using machine translation for social science. So I just wanted to flag that before I get into it. So the data, this is just 1 year of the Latinx essays data. So 88,000 essays in total. What I didn't tell you earlier is that we were also, my team was also working with a racially representative random sample from 2016, 2017 that did not have Latinx students. So the way to think about our data here is I'm just looking at the 2 circles on the left in the Venn diagram. So we also have self-reported household income and ethnic identity, which I organized by Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, or other. All of the other responses were organized by Central America, South America, or Europe. So the process of labeling Spanish words for this project was laborious and very time intensive. Basically, computationally, I took each word that appeared in each essay and at least one time, and then I used a combination of the Google Translate AI and hand coding to label words as being either Spanish or not Spanish. So there were over 81,000 words that appeared in the essays. The AI labeled over 4,000 words as Spanish, but I went through and I found another 2,500 words that I labeled as being plausibly Spanish. So for example, common names like Jessica, words that appear often in English and Spanish like taco, names of businesses, organizations, groups, Suavitel, were often labeled as the AI as not being Spanish, which I think, I don't know, in this crowd, I hope someone kind of takes that even to the next level. So I also did a lot of hand coding. Is Los Angeles a Spanish word? Like, yes, literally, but it's also like a place name in the US. There are also a lot of words that are spelled the same in English and Spanish. So I did a lot of hand checking and I removed these kinds of like, you know, instances where the word is spelled the same in English and Spanish. I also filtered out all of the US-based place names. So after that filtering, I was left with 33% of Latinx applicants using at least one word of Spanish in their essays, and 15% of non-Latinx applicants using at least one word of Spanish in their essays. I also want to point out that if you extrapolate this to the entire applicant pool, this means that about 20% of all University of California applicants, regardless of background, are using at least some form of Spanish in their admissions essays. So it's not, oh, okay, perfect. No, this is good timing. So as it turns out, it's not just that there's a high volume of students using Spanish, it's also distributed fairly well across the income distribution. So even though the dots on the far right, which represent the highest income students, there just weren't a lot of students reporting that high of income. So there's a lot of there's a wide distribution of students using Spanish. The last thing I did is I labeled each instance of Spanish as being either substantive, so it's a conversation excerpt. This is an excerpt from an actual essay, or nominal, where they're just kind of naming things. So I wanted to get at kind of deeper expressions of Spanish versus not quite as deep expressions of Spanish. And this is what I used this is what I compared this is what I used to see if there were usage patterns by income and ethnicity. So this figure, so the blue represents students who use some kind of like complicated, longer form, deeper instance of Spanish that are high income, and then the red represents lower income. And the key thing I want to point out here is that Mexican and Central American students that were below income were the only students who were more likely instances of Spanish than not. And that's compared to every other group. So every other group was less likely to use them. It was only low-income Mexican and Central American students were more likely to use the most complex forms of Spanish. So, I mentioned this extrapolates to about 20% of the UC applicant pool. Even though Mexican and Central American students have faced a lot of stigma for their linguistic practices, they were the ones who were using the most complex constructions the most frequently. And machine translation worked well, but clearly there were a lot of I had to identify thousands of words to create my my dictionary. Clearly, there's a lot of room for growth for machine translation. So I'm kind of flying through these. All of these findings, what I hope you take away from this, so they're at the college admissions level. There's fundamental variation in application materials, from numerical information to college student choices to essay strategy. But again, at this this disaggregated kind of regional heritage level. So the UC system has lots of Latinx students, but how might the servingness vary across institutions given this variation? And then finally, maybe most provocatively, I think, as a community, we might have to have a very serious conversation about data decolonization. I mean, basically, the question I'm always left with is, should these European identities even count as Latinx, given the way that we use this category? And should disaggregated data be widely available for scholars and practitioners? In terms of suggestions, the UC system shares disaggregated data. This is from their website. Maybe your institution could as well. Just because the HSI designation is not specific in terms of disaggregated data, you can there's a lot of variation in the Latinx experience given geography. So if I did these studies in Florida, it would look very different. If I did them in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, it would look very different. And then finally, studying race, in and with data science requires a lot of nuance, lest it replicates flattened notions of Latinx people and experiences. So that's kind of like my kind of charge This is the new data science building at the University of Florida, and I'm hoping to raise a lot of hell there. University of Florida is an emergent HSI, and I think Florida is a place where we need to be really careful about how we're handling and considering this data. That's it. Thank you all so much.